After today, we have just 2 classes left, and I want to devote those 2 classes to the presuppositions, the social theoretical and philosophical presuppositions of this programmatic argument. So next week, the subject will be the idea of structure, the theory of structure, of structural change, structural discontinuity, and structural alternatives, and the implications of these ideas about structure for the way we think about agency, the political and social alliances that can sustain these programmatic alternatives. And in the last week, the subject is the ideal, the assumptions about human nature and about the direction of our ascent that inform the programmatic arguments of this semester. Today, the subject is globalization. Up to now, I've addressed the question of alternatives always in the context of what remains the primary setting of transformation, the nation state. But of course, humanity will not always be divided in this particular form, the form of armed states, and the programmatic arguments that we have considered have implications for how we think about world order. I propose to organize today's discussion in the following way. First, I want to give a historical introduction to globalization, comparing the present episode of globalization to the previous episode. Then I want to explore the character of the present form of globalization in the setting of the global trade regime, and contrast it to an alternative that would be more hospitable to the kinds of institutional ideas that I have explored and defended earlier in the semester. Third, I want to address more generally the question of world order and of how we might have world order, how we might govern the world without establishing a world government. And finally, in the 4th step of the discussion, to turn to the momentous change in the character of the nation and of the differences among nations, which occurs in the present epoch. So first, globalization viewed historically. In the recent history of humanity, globalization has come twice. First, in the period from about 1870 to the outbreak of the First World War, and then from the aftermath of the Second World War to today, accelerating from the early 1970s, from about 1971 on. In between, in the period between the 2 wars, there was a breakdown of globalization. The earlier form of globalization was undermined before the new form began to emerge in the aftermath of the Second War. Now, it cannot be said that the present form of globalization, the present episode of globalization, has given us more globalization than the previous one, in some rough quantitative sense. Although the gross capital flows in the today are greater than they were in the previous episode of globalization. The net capital flows are still smaller. Trade flows, the aggregate of world commerce, has only recently become greater than it was in the previous episode of globalization. And migratory flows in the present episode of globalization are much smaller than they were in the previous episode. So there isn't any simple expansion of globalization from the earlier episode to the present one. Now let me go on to compare and contrast these two episodes of globalization, the better to define what is distinctive about the present episode. So first, their similarities. Both of them have occurred under the aegis of an idea and a practice of convergence. The convergence of the different states and economies of the world to more similar institutions and practices. The idea of convergence and the practice of convergence is similar to both these episodes of globalization. And moreover, in both these episodes of globalization, convergence was enforced by the discipline of capital. It wasn't just an abstract idea or commitment. In the previous episode of globalization, it was enforced by the gold standard. The gold standard produced an automatic mechanism limiting divergence. And its role, as I reminded you, invoking a remark of the economist Kalecki in a previous class, was to make the level of economic activity depend on the level of confidence, of financial confidence. Now, what about the discipline of capital in the present episode of globalization? The gold standard has been cast aside, most definitively since 1971, when the United States, the American government, broke its last link to the metallic basis of fiat currency. But there is, at least in some parts of the world, what you could call a functional alternative to the gold standard, imposing the discipline of capital with similar effects, albeit by a different mechanism. In Latin America, the functional alternative of the gold standard has consisted in a syndrome, a combination of policies and institutions. The acquiescence of the Latin American countries and economies in a low level of domestic saving, the consequent dependence on foreign capital, foreign saving, the openness of the capital account to permit the flow of money in and out, and in the administration of the fiscal state of the government, the emphasis on a form of fiscal prudence or realism, emphasizing constraints on spending rather than expansion of public revenue. The Latin American countries have been obedient. they have signed on the dotted line of the recommendations made to them by the economic, academic, and political authorities of the rich North Atlantic world. And the foreseeable consequence of this prostration has been their fall in the world economy, reminding us that rebellion is not always rewarded in history, but obedience is invariably punished. In the rich North Atlantic countries, there has been another looser functional alternative to the gold standard. The so-called policies of austerity, especially in Europe and the European Union. Because these policies of austerity, emphasizing the importance of financial confidence, have something of a similar effect to the effect of the gold standard. Now, not all parts of the world have responded in the same way to the constraints of the present form of globalization. So the Northeast Asian economies in general, and China in particular, have taken a very different direction. Depending to a much larger extent on domestic saving rather than foreign capital, and imposing severe restraints on the openness of the capital accounts. And this demonstrates that it is not justified for any country, for any national government, to use the constraints of globalization, including financial globalization, as a straitjacket that requires it to do this or that. The Northeast Asian economies and China demonstrate that even within the constraints of the present form of globalization, there is a great deal of room for maneuver if the state wants to take it and adopts the strategies and the policies that preserve the area of maneuver. Now consider the major differences between these two episodes of globalization. The one that prevailed from about 1870 to the beginning of the First World War, and then the one that has emerged since the end of the Second World War. The first difference is a momentous change in the global division of labor. A change which is still not adequately appreciated. In the previous episode of globalization, the basic foundation of global trade was exchange between richer, capital-intensive economies, the developed economies of the North Atlantic world and their outposts throughout the globe, and poorer, labor-intensive economies. And that idea of the basis of world trade, of its linchpin, continues to be the central idea of conventional trade theory, although it no longer applies to the same extent. The global division of labor has changed. And now there is no longer this simple division between capital-intensive and labor-intensive economies. The new productive vanguard of the knowledge economy, the insular vanguard discussed earlier, in our course, exists in all the major economies of the world. In China, in India, in Brazil, as well as in the United States, Germany, and Japan. And you could even say that this network of the productive vanguards spread through the world is the commanding force of the world economy. There's some reason to think that high finance is more a sideshow rather than itself the commanding force. So it is present in the major continental developing economies, as well as in the rich economies of the North Atlantic world. With the result that the basis of world trade has fundamentally changed to a degree that goes regularly unnoticed. The second major difference between these two episodes of globalization is the vast distinction in the prominence of mass migration. Mass migration was much greater quantitatively and in its consequences in the earlier episode of globalization than it is today. And this fact has very great significance for the inequalities among national economies. You might say that of all possible ways of diminishing inequality among countries, by far the most significant is any increase in the mobility of labor to cross national frontiers. In the present episode of globalization, migration, although an object of political dispute and responsible for many political reversals in different countries, is on the whole much, much smaller and exercises to a much lower degree its equalizing effects in the world. The third difference between these two episodes of globalization has to do with convergence and the resistance to it. So in the present episode of globalization, convergence is much more clearly articulated as a goal by those countries, those governments that defend it. That is the substance of what's called neoliberalism, or the Washington Consensus, an explicit, articulated, argued defense of globalization as convergence to the same set of supposedly best institutions and policies. In the earlier episode of globalization, the idea of convergence was much less clearly articulated and left implicit. On the other hand, the opposition to globalization, where it exists, is also much more clearly expressed and more vigorously pressed. So many of the major continental developing countries, some of them with a history of great civilizations in the past, have the material conditions and the spiritual resources with which to imagine themselves as distinct worlds, I China, India. And this fact provides a powerful basis for resistance to the idea of convergence. What, on the other hand, weighs against this tapping of the practical and spiritual resources of these great countries to resist convergence is mental colonialism. The participation of their elites, of their academic elites, and derivatively of their political elites in the ideas disseminated in the world by the academies of the rich countries of the North Atlantic world. So many of these countries are then, as it were, divided between the potential and the temptation to resist convergence, and the yoke of mental colonialism, which eviscerates the power of resistance. So there you have a simple account of the similarities and the differences of these two episodes of globalization. Now there's one more thing to say by way of this account. So in the previous episode of globalization, the cause of globalization was identified with the major Western powers. And there were a variety of them. This was the age of the construction of empires. In the present episode of globalization, the cause of globalization has been largely identified with a single country, the United States. And in the eyes of humanity, a confusion exists about Americanization and globalization. Globalization appears in the eyes of humanity as to a significant extent a form of Americanization. And the ambivalence to globalization in its established form is to a large extent an ambivalence to Americanization. And I'll speak more about the nature and the consequences of this fact later on in today's discussion. Now, for the moment, that's all I want to say by way of this first historical introduction, comparing the two episodes of globalization. Let me stop and ask for your comments or questions about this first set of remarks. Yes?
I just have a question. So you were discussing mental colonialism as the...
Speak a little more loudly, please.
Yeah, you were discussing mental colonialism as one of the main factors that lead to resistance.
Yes.
And specifically refer to countries like China and India. I'm just curious because I think that there's been a lot of debate about whether or not it's just a factor of academic and political elites sort of aligning themselves with Western ideals, because I also think colonialism came with a lot of economic ramifications that were very difficult for a lot of countries to sort of navigate after the British sort of left India and used
Yes.
India as a specific case. So to what extent is it, in your opinion, just mental colonialism versus some level of like economic remnants that are physically still there?
Well, of course, there are many remnants of practical remnants of colonial rule where colonial rule existed. But I was just trying to distinguish the separate element of the mental, of the conceptual, which is often in tension with the other elements. After all, China was never occupied, and there's the same thing. So if you go to the Central Party School in Beijing, which forms the cadres of the Chinese Communist Party, you would be surprised to find what they're discussing there. They're not discussing the theories of Karl Marx or various other forms of opposition to the established order in the world. Most of their time is spent discussing the ideas and the books of second and third rate Western academics. So, and it's an astonishing fact to a foreigner, and to a leftist foreigner, it's surprising. So that's a very clear demonstration of what I mean by mental colonialism. Why are they doing that? It's a great country with great power. It's about to become the largest economies in the world. It's opposed to the dominant power of the United States, but they're discussing the books, the doctrines of these second and third rate Western, especially American academics. Something is strange about that. So I'm simply observing this fact. It's a surprising fact. Now let me give you another example, the example of my own country, Brazil. So the intelligentsia is mainly divided between two currents. And this is not just in Brazil, this is in a large part of the world. So one current is a fossilized, shrunken Marxism, which has basically taken from the zeitgeist an axe, and with this axe, cut Marxism in half. It's thrown out the good part, which is the transformative aspirations, and it's kept the bad part, the historical fatalism. So that's half of the life of the intelligentsia. The other half is a carbon copy of second-rate American-style social science and policy discourse, like, you know, the Kennedy School or something. So this is what passes in Brazil and in much of the world for the alternative. So there's this disconnection between the potential of these countries to rebel, to mark a different path in the world, and the ideas that are entertained by their elites. Now, what happens, I gave you the example of these two main currents in Brazilian intellectual life. They actually converge because they're two, it's like there are two forms of fatalism. That is, the American-style social science says, this is how things have to be. This is the rationalization of the real. And the fatalistic, shrunken form of Marxism is another version of the same thing with a kind of left tilt. But it's not a left tilt having to do with action. So it's another apology for resignation. So it's as if you had two voices here, right? And the two voices are all joining in the chorus of fate. This is the discourse. This is the background to this episode of globalization. This is the intellectual background to this present episode of globalization. Yes, continue.
Small follow-up to that. I don't know if this is necessarily like true, but it's something that I guess I've read about and sort of seen. It's interesting to me because I think you mentioned migration, and I think there is a large number of people who migrate from a lot of these countries to Western countries, whether it's England or the United States of America. And I think you see within diasporas in the United States or diasporas
Yes.
in England, there tends to be a period or a lot of movement towards some level of like cultural resistance and reclamation that sometimes comes with rejecting these very typical Western ideals. Do you feel like the challenging or perhaps some level of like mental decolonization can come from migration of, you know, people from these countries into other nations and going through a period of
Well, I don't think it's, I would hesitate to characterize it as resistance to the West, because this is, of course, a debate within the West also. The question is, what is one's attitude to the established arrangements in the world, and to what degree do you imagine it susceptible to resistance and replacement? That's the crucial question. It's not a question of West versus non-West. And now I think it's true that the kind of migration that happens in the world, especially of educated and skilled workers, frequently results in a rethinking of the basis of national autonomy. That's distant from their countries, they come to have a higher appreciation, a different insight into the possibilities of resistance, of the creation of something new. So this also occurs. So it's not just some kind of simple assimilation. Yes?
Out of curiosity, I was wondering if you could maybe mention one or two of the second or third American thinkers being taught.
No, I think that would be clearly insidious. And after all, one of the attributes of being second rate is that you're fungible. So, so their names are unimportant, right? They're tradable for one another. That's the whole point of being second rate. So we can disregard their individual names. Now, any other remarks about this initial? Okay, so now let me go to the second stage of my discussion, which is defining the specific character of the present episode of globalization in a particular context, and in a context which I think is especially revealing, which is the world trading system. As it is organized and expressed, not just under the WTO treaties, but under what is the main practical successor to the WTO, the World Trade Organization arrangements, which are the new multilateral trade pacts that are being negotiated in different forms around the world, like the Trans-Pacific, the Transatlantic trade pacts. So there are 3 or 4 distinctive characteristics of the particular kind of globalization that is now being organized in this second episode of globalization in the Organization of World Commerce and under the aegis of the WTO and of its multilateral successors. So the first basic principle is the idea that free trade should be maximized. Free trade is, as it were, the idealized goal of this regime, the maximum amount of free trade. Now, it's not obvious that free trade should be considered an end in itself. The alternative to it would be to say, the goal is not free trade. Free trade is a means, it's not an end. A better account of the goal under an alternative would be, the goal is the coexistence in the world of many different development trajectories and experiences of civilization within a world economy that gradually becomes more open. That's the goal. And free trade is sometimes good or sometimes bad, but does not deserve to be considered a goal. Now let me take the second principle of this prevailing form of globalization. and it's much more concrete. It could be put under the label of what you might call institutional maximalism, by which I mean that the participating countries in the regime of world trade are required not just to adhere to a market economy in the abstract, but to adhere to a very particular form of market economy with a very concrete institutional definition. As I've argued earlier in the course, a market order has no single natural and necessary form. In principle, there are many different ways of organizing a market. But the market that is intended or implied by this form of commercial globalization has very specific characteristics. And it wants to prohibit any kind of significant institutional or legal divergence from the model of the market economy that it intends to impose on the trading countries as a condition of their participation in the world trading regime. So let me give you two examples. So the first example is to outlaw, under the label subsidies, prohibited subsidies, all the forms of strategic coordination between governments and businesses that the countries that are now rich used to become rich, but that they want to deny to the latecomers. So all these forms of strategic coordination that were prominent, for example, in the emergence of the initial globalizing country, Great Britain, or then in the United States, they're all prohibited as subsidies. The second example is the incorporation into the regime of world trade of the rather odious regime of intellectual property developed at the end of the 19th century. The patent regime and its corollaries, which is a relatively late evolution, beginning to emerge as it did only at the end of the 19th century, and that has the consequence of leaving many of the technological innovations of greatest interest to humanity in the grip, in the control of a handful of private multinational businesses. So the tendency of this dominant form of globalization is to impose this institutional maximalism. Now, we know for a fact that it doesn't have to do that. The reason why we know that for a fact is that the immediate precursor to the WTO and the subsequent multilateral trade pacts, which was the regime of the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, also subsequent to the Second World War, so recent, was characterized by the opposite tendency of what you could call institutional minimalism. The maximum of openness to trade with the minimum of restraint on institutional or legal experiments, including experiments in the legal form of a market economy. So that wasn't in some distant historical epoch or under different conditions. That was just a few years ago in the regime that preceded the WTO. So there's no reason to think that this institutional maximalism is somehow necessary. Now, there is a technical or legal dispute about the extent to which globalization and world trade require harmonization of the institutions and laws of different countries participating in the world trade regime. So there is an argument, for example, that substantive divergence of the law and of the institutions in the different underlying jurisdictions of the trading countries results in excessive transactions costs that then impede trade. And this claim, this idea, because it is after all an abstraction, an idea, gets built into the nomenclature. So there are two different metrics or vocabularies in which to describe world trade. There's the traditional trade flows nomenclature that is just describing the amount of trade and its value. And then there's the nomenclature of barriers to trade. So and then the barriers to trade include definitionally any divergence in the underlying laws. So then it's as if this idea that underlying substantive legal divergence impedes trades were built into the conclusion as a definitional matter through this nomenclature that I've just described. It's like a semantic conceit or a semantic trick. Now, we have a long experience in history of the possibility of reconciling trade with the divergence of underlying law. That, after all, was the premise of the traditional law merchant. When the Hanseatic League, for example, traded with Russia, the whole point was that they were different. And the legal or institutional differences were just a part of all the other differences. And the lawyers became good at reconciling the rules of international trade with a large amount of substantive underlying difference in the legally defined institutional arrangements. So one might view with considerable suspicion this idea that as a matter of the logic of harmonization and the suppression of transaction costs, world trade requires the suppression of legal difference. One might say that in principle, the more different the countries are, the more reason there is for them to trade. And the legal differences are simply an aspect of all their other differences. So that's a second generative principle and the contrast to it. Institutional maximalism contrasted with institutional minimalism. Now, the third principle of the now dominant form of globalization has to do with the relative mobility of capital, of things, and of labor. The dominant principle of the present form of globalization is that money and things should have as much freedom as possible to cross national frontiers. that is what is meant by maximizing free trade, by treating free trade as if it were an end in itself. However, people should be imprisoned in the nation state or in blocks of relatively homogeneous nation states, such as the European Union. In other words, according to this dominant form of globalization, there should be a contrast between the mobility of capital and of goods and services, and the immobility of labor. Now, you might ask whether there is any basis in democratic theory or in economic theory for such a contrast. And that might then suggest to you an alternative third principle, which is that things, money, and people, if they are to gain freedom to cross national frontiers, should gain freedom together in small cumulative steps. And there should not be this radical contrast between freedom for things and for money and unfreedom for people. After all, taking a more philosophical position, you might say the freedom of things and of money to move is sometimes good and sometimes bad. But the freedom of people to move is sacrosanct because it is part of the process by which humanity becomes both diverse and unified. Now, of course, labor mobility, if it were achieved in one fell swoop, would be intolerable. It would be revolutionary. It would be a revolutionary solvent of all established states. So one is not contrasting this dominant principle of mobility for money and for things and immobility for labor with an alternative of radical and sudden right in the enfranchisement of labor to cross national frontiers. It would have to be gradual. And it would have to be accompanied by safeguards for the receiving countries. So the receiving countries receive labor, and then there's a spectrum that goes from a guest worker with rights, a temporary worker, a permanent resident, and only at the end of the spectrum, a citizen. And compensations for the sending countries, especially if they send skilled labor, that they would receive compensation for the investment in human capital that form those people. So any advance in the mobility of labor to be feasible, to be practical, would have to be both gradual and accompanied by these safeguards for both the sending and the receiving countries. But what matters in this contrast, which I just stated, is not how far you go at any one moment. It's the direction. And the question is whether this principle is the right direction or whether we should have the alternative. Now, there's one possible fourth characterization still, which I could suggest, of what makes this present form of globalization distinctive in the commercial domain. And so the question is, should a free world economy be based on free labor? The question of the status of labor vis-a-vis capital. And the principle should be, yes, a free world economy should be based on free labor. And of course, economies at different levels of development must be able to compete, among other things, on the basis of differential returns to labor. It can't be that the same levels are universally applied regardless of the level of development. But still the question remains of how much will be implied or demanded by way of this idea of the freedom of free labor. So I said that the present form of globalization is institutionally maximalist, but it's not institutionally maximalist with respect to its ideas about free labor. It doesn't demand this or that kind of freedom for the workers to organize, to agitate, to increase their bargaining power. And you might say that the opposing form would be that the country should be free to experiment. In those institutional arrangements that would increase the bargaining power of labor vis-a-vis capital. In other words, the principle of free labor should not just be a static principle, it should have a dynamic element. And ultimately, this dynamic element should include the idea that countries should be free to experiment in those transformations of the institutional and legal architecture of the market order that could eventually point in the direction of superseding economically dependent wage labor as the predominant form of free work, and point toward the substitution of economically dependent wage labor by free employment and cooperation. And of course, this transformation, assuring the freedom of free labor, would eventually require the ability of the trading countries to experiment in the nature of property, in the nature of the property regime, as we discussed in the idea of the capital auction, to experiment with the terms on which there is decentralized access to capital. So by suggesting these four contrasts, what I've tried to do is to define the specific character of the present form of globalization in the commercial domain, which is the most salient or visible domain of globalization. And I state this idea in the service of a proposition. The proposition is that the most significant debate that we can have about globalization is not how much globalization, but which globalization. It's not whether we have more or less globalization, it's what kind of globalization. And with respect to each of these four characteristics, I've illustrated how the dominant form of globalization in this present second episode of globalization is contentious, is contestable, and can be contrasted to an alternative. And that's the real debate that should exist, and that would be the counterpart in the discussion of globalization to all the other discussions that we've had in the course in the national context. So that's, as it were, the second stage of the discussion. Again, let me stop and ask for your comments and questions. So there's a specific thesis. The thesis is that this isn't just globalization. This is one kind of globalization. It has a very specific profile. It has very specific characteristics. And these characteristics become manifest when we contrast it to alternatives on each of the 4 points that I mentioned. Now, I've just spoken about, of course, trade. We could take any other aspect of the problem. For example, we could take the world monetary regime, in which the dominant reserve currency of the world remains the United States dollar, and we're now in a transition to something else, which remains undefined. But I think that the discussion in the commercial context is especially interesting and suggestive. So you can see how on each of these points that I've mentioned, the topic of globalization could become an object of debate within national politics. On each of these points, the mobility of labor and versus the mobility of things and of capital, the institutional minimalism versus the institutional maximalism, the implications of the commitment to free labor and so forth. All of this is part of the debate. And if the discussion of these commercial treaties, these multilateral trade pacts were seen more broadly, all of these topics would be debated when these pacts come up, but of course they're not. Yes?
I'm no expert on trade law or anything like that, but when you say that there's disagreement about the extent to which free trade requires harmonisation of laws, I understand that you don't need the substantive domestic law to be necessarily harmonised, but do you not need institutions like, in the Brexit case, European Court of Justice to be the arbiter of those disputes? Or do you not need local multinational?
Well, there are many ways of dealing with disputes, right? So going back to the historical example, which we have of the law merchant, the law merchant developed a distinct law of international commercial transactions, which was designed by the jurists to be capable of reconciliation with a very broad range of difference in substantive private law. And they had their own courts, like mercantile courts. And now, of course, there's arbitration. So there are many procedural things that would go with this. So if technically the aim is to reconcile trade and harmonization of the law of international transactions with diversity of private law in the individual national jurisdictions, there's a huge amount that can be done in that direction. And we know that historically because that's what the whole history of the law merchant was. So that's just by way of signaling a degree of suspicion or resistance to the idea that we can push all this demand for convergence of rules under the rug, under the label of harmonization, minimization of transaction costs, and so forth. Because the whole history of trade among countries is in the opposite direction of that. It's taking a huge amount of substantive difference as given and then dealing with it and finding a way to reconcile that. So there's an empirical element, right? We can't know in the abstract beforehand until we try, until we experiment, how far we can go in reconciling divergence of the law of underlying jurisdictions with the degree of technical harmonization that's necessary for seamless trade. We'll only know when we set our hands to it. But we do know from history they can go it can go very far. And so, to my mind, that's enough to establish this contrast that I was trying to make between minimalism and maximalism. When then we have the commitment to harmonization built into our way of thinking by a sleight of hand of nomenclature, as I gave this example, of the predominance of the metric of barriers to trade over the metric of trade flows, then it's even worse, huh? Because we're tying our own hands deliberately without dealing with the problem. And I think at the background is this substantive conjecture that I'm making, that the more difference, the better. That's the reason to trade. The reason to the empirical basis of the doctrine of comparative advantage, which is the central conception of Ricardian trade theory, is that the economies are different, and their cultural difference, their legal difference, is associated with all their other differences. I think that's what inspires the idea. Yes.
So, in particularly the Gulf countries, you mentioned that free labor or laborers tend to be confined to particular nation states with a couple of exceptions. And one of those exceptions, with millions, tens of millions of primarily South Asian workers who spend most of their lives working in essentially the gig economy sector, aiding in construction and crude oil extraction in the Gulf countries.
Yes.
That represents, at least in theory, a form of free labor. Obviously not an ideal one because up to 10,000 or so die every year because of their lack of political rights. It seems to me that the reason why you set up that kind of exchange is because between nation states, South Asian states that want to share oil profits, and the Gulf countries that require labor to extract and build up those economies, you would create an arrangement where free labor or labor is more free in relation to the current trade regime. My question is, how can you avoid the kind of exploitation that occurs in these workers while still allowing, for the sovereignty of nation states to negotiate their own, relations between one another? Is there some kind of body that can regulate these types of transactions and interactions?
Well, I don't understand it. So the question is, what will be the legal presupposition with respect to labor of these commercial agreements?
Yes.
So now you say this is a restraint on sovereignty, but the institutional maximalism is already a restraint on sovereignty. So when the trade pacts say you can't subsidize, you can't have this strategic coordination between government and business, you have to respect the intellectual property rules and so forth. All of that is a restraint on sovereignty. It's just that when it comes to labor, there's no restraint at all. So what I'm suggesting as this fourth principle is that countries would remain free to compete in the difference of returns to labor, but there would be an increasing scale or increasing pressure to ensure that free labor is really free and not just pro forma free. And that implies a series of rights that would prevent these worst abuses to which you just referred. So it seems to me it's invidious to say this is a restraint on sovereignty, but the other things aren't. The things that are in the interest of capital or of the owners of intangible property or something. And this is much more important than those things, because this is dealing with then what is supposedly the basis of the whole system, which is freedom, the freedom of the individual economic agent. So I would say they should continue to be free to continue to compete on the wage, on the wage level, the real wage, but with this upward tilt on the rules relating to empowerment, to the empowerment of labor. Yes?
I guess this is a question about the whole system. agree that the restraints and constraints on sovereignty are a little idiosyncratic in the current system. So my question is essentially, what body do you propose, or if not a body, what institutional arrangement would you propose to encourage nation states to adopt the sort of proposals and principles that we discussed as alternatives to the ones that currently exist? Maybe you'll get there, in which case.
Well, what body? You mean a body higher than so? One way in which I can interpret your question is it's a question about whether one should think there's some kind of jurisdictional or political hierarchy above the states. So this choice of direction is being made in a world in which there is no world government now, right? So the world is governing itself without a world government now. That's not a proposal I'm making, that's a description of the reality. Now, it's choosing to govern itself in this way through the cumulative effect of these treaties. It could choose to govern itself in another way. Now, am I a defender of a world government? No, I'm not. That's the subject I want to come back to next. So, the world does not want and should not need a world government to govern itself. And it needs an alternative to a world government. And that problem becomes especially significant with respect not to the commercial issues that we've been discussing up to now, but to the political issues, especially to armed conflict among the states, which is then the next subject of discussion. Now, yes.
I guess I'm just curious to hear your thoughts. I think that there are a lot of people who feel that like the World Trade Organization, these like collective organizations that have jurisdiction over like international trade law, are not particularly effective because they're already dominated by certain countries to begin with.
Well, they're not. Well, the World Trade Organization has, in effect, been superseded now, to a large extent, by these multilateral trade pacts. So the major trading countries are taking things into their own hands, and they're dealing directly with one another. And so the World Trade Organization has been, to a significant extent, marginalized. But it's the same system. So the system of institutional maximalism, of maximizing freedom for things and for capital, but leaving people immobile, all those things that I mentioned, which started under the WTO treaties, now continue under the multilateral trade pacts. So where does the initiative come from in a world in which there is no world government? That's the question. Now, if you give me just 2 minutes, I'll be right back. In the meantime, you can think about this, and I'll come back. They've managed to lock this door?
Absolutely.
Okay,
Yeah, it's actually
yeah.
Yeah. No, we should absolutely do that. Just think of the case.
So, how does a world without a world government govern itself? This is now the subject of the third stage of my discussion. And the premise is that the world does not want or need a world government. And the justification of that premise will actually come at the end, in the fourth stage of the discussion, if I get to it. So there are all sorts of schemes for the regeneration of world order, for governing a world without world government. And it's very easy to put all this stuff on paper. So like the people who wrote an imaginary constitution for Corsica or for Poland in the 18th century, it's possible to sit down and imagine various proposals for the government of the world. The reality is that in the attempt to provide global public goods or avert great global harms like catastrophic climate change or war, especially war among the great powers, there's really only one thing that works by the test of experience. The only thing that works is voluntary cooperation among states. Humanity is divided among these armed states, the distinct forms of life, the experiments and ways of being human, develop under the shield of these armed states. And there isn't a plethora of possible solutions to the problem of global governance. There's only one solution. And the one solution is indicated by experience. It's some form of cooperation among the states. In the area, in the political realm and in the realm of the control of war, of armed conflict, the only system we have is the United Nations. And it has to be judged a failure. So the General Assembly is a debating society established under the Westphalian pretense of the equality of all states, from the great powers to minuscule pseudo-states, who all have the same vote and in the same club. The Security Council is paralyzed by the attribution of the veto power to 5 permanent members, the 5 actual or putative victors of a war that ended 75 years ago. And so one of them is the supreme power, the highest power of the United States. 2 are allies of the United States in a military alliance. The 4th is a state that is armed to the teeth and unresigned to its loss of world power. And the 5th is the major rival of the United States, China. So what happens there is that when the United States goes to the Security Council to achieve redress for its vital security interests and fails to get what it wants, it goes outside the Security Council and organizes a so-called coalition of the willing to achieve a similar result. So the system that's designed on paper is like a balloon which is filled with air or emptied of air according to the desires of the great powers. So that doesn't work either. So the only thing at which the United Nations has worked is it has served as an umbrella organization for voluntary collaboration of the states on particular issues, like the climate issue. This is the arrangement of the Conference of the Parties that resulted in the Paris Agreement, the Glasgow Agreements, and so forth. So from this principle, then, one can infer the idea that the inevitable, the unavoidable beginning of global governance is voluntary cooperation among what you could call coalitions of the willing. And there are three kinds of them. First, there are special purpose coalitions in which the states get together to resolve a particular problem, like, for example, solar energy. And we could imagine a much more ambitious object for these special purpose coalitions. For example, we discussed the question of a knowledge economy for the many. How do you develop technologies and practices that can establish the knowledge economy outside of the islands in which it now flourishes? That could be the object of one of these special purpose coalitions. Then there are similar state coalitions, which are coalitions among states that have a similar status or function within the world system, like the G7, the G20, and the BRICS. The BRICS bring together China, India, Russia, Brazil, and South Africa. And finally, there are the regional coalitions of the willing, of which the most significant is the European Union. But there's the African Union, the Organization of Arab States, and so forth. And then there is the question of how one would deal with the most difficult problem, which is armed conflict among the great states, among the great powers. Against the background of two historical examples that we have. One example is the example of what was called the Concert of Europe in the 19th century, organized largely by Bismarck and his contemporaries, which the object is to achieve an understanding among the major powers, which prevents any country from having to choose between war and surrender, and operates on a flexible middle ground between war and ideology. Always susceptible to being reformed in the light of experience. And there's the example of the League of Nations, which in some ways was more advanced than the United Nations and less limited. But still limited because it had a whole vocabulary of covenants and codicils and councils, so that it lacked the flexibility to compensate for its crucial failures, weaknesses. Absence of support by the United States, absence of armed force, and so forth. So the best prospect then for global governance on this view is the gradual development, the cumulative force of this cooperation among states, of the three kinds that I mentioned, the special purpose coalitions, the similar state coalitions, and the regional coalitions. And then what you could call a fourth kind of association, which is an informal entente, in which the middle level powers develop an understanding of the security interests of the major powers of the world and work together with them to identify their vital security interests and to guarantee them against violations of those security interests. So they begin to form an informal, inchoate regime and understanding of the security interests of the major and middle level powers in the world. Now, any power is, of course, free to defy these understandings and to defend itself. But there is an automatic mechanism of correction, because any power that defies the understandings of the Entente leads the other members of the Entente to gather together against it, to resist it. Now, this has to be seen against the background of two entirely singular facts about the world situation. So we now have this condition in which there are two main powers in the world, the United States and China. So one of these two, China, is uniquely bereft of friends and allies. It has no allies, with the partial exceptions of Pakistan, North Korea, and Cambodia. It has this Belt and Road Initiative. It distributes money, and every time it distributes money, it acquires more enemies. It's largely friendless in the world. The United States is in the opposite situation. It's full of allies, but it's not in imaginative communion with humanity, because it is a great power which, as I observed in an earlier class, stands at the extreme of a spectrum. The most unequal, the most religious, the one in which paradoxically the majority of people continue to believe that everything is possible. So it's as if these two great powers, for different reasons, were both like awkward and solipsistic Gullivers. What should humanity do with them? It should do with them what the Lilliputians did with the original Gulliver. It should tie them down with strings. And the strings are this combination of all these forms of cooperative activity, these coalitions, that we could hope that these powers will ultimately come to see as more useful than restrictive. To enmesh them in a combination of cooperative commitments that would turn the vinegar of their reciprocal belligerence back into the wine of peaceful cooperation and competition. Now, this is a very roundabout and dangerous course to the governance of the world. But my premise in the discussion is that there's no alternative to it. Given that the world, for good reason, rejects world government. It doesn't want an empire with its cast of jurists and ministers and minions surrounding the emperor. So the premise of all of this is that we develop our humanity, the powers and possibilities of humanity, only by developing it in different directions. And if these different directions are to be something more than folklore, just intangible culture, they have to be manifest in different institutional arrangements. And the institutional arrangements have to develop under the shield of these armed states. And that puts us in the situation of danger that I've just described. So this was the problem that in an earlier stage in the evolution of the world, Grotius confronted at the beginning of the state system in the West. And in a sense, this arrangement that I'm describing to you is a 21st century equivalent to the Grotian scheme. The cooperative activity of states results in a kind of proto-law, law before law, which it is then the cumulative development of a public international law, a customary law, which is the crystallized residue of the activities of all these coalitions of the willing. And the cumulative development of this cooperative activity is what then can produce this entanglement of compromise and commitment, which seems to be our best prospect. Now, what then is the philosophical premise of this argument that leads to this idea that we cannot have a world government? There is no natural form of social life. We develop, civilization develops, humanity develops, only by developing its powers and possibilities in different directions. And then we come, then, under this idea, to this momentous change that has happened in the character of the national difference, to which I referred in an earlier class. And I'm now going to remind you of that discussion. The nations of the world used to be like tribes, most of them, based on a principle of quasi-biological affinity, similarity of experience and of vision. And the national identity took a tangible customary form. So, for example, to be an ancient Roman was to live according to the customs of the ancient Romans. That's what I mean by this old tribal idea of the nation. Now we're in the situation of world history in which the nations are all competing with one another economically, militarily, and ideologically in some worldwide emulation. And in order to prosper and triumph in this competition, they have to raid one another. They have to go around the world and take some part of the practices and institutions of some other country and combine it with some part of themselves and give up a part of themselves. So the tangible customary identities are progressively hollowed out. And what survives is the desire to be different, the will to difference that is aroused rather than quieted by the waning of actual difference. And that leads to the situation that I described in that earlier class. Two nations live side by side, and they hate each other, not because they're different, but because they're becoming alike, and because they want to be different. This is the peculiarly poisonous character of contemporary nationalism. Tangible difference is porous and susceptible to compromise. The intangible will to difference is necessarily the object of an intransigent faith. There's nothing that can be compromised. And that is its peculiarly dangerous character. Faced with that reality, then, there are two solutions that are presented to humanity. There's a solution of liberal cosmopolitanism, suppress difference, the idea of convergence. And there's a solution of regressive nationalism. Return to inherited difference. And what I then want to defend in this discussion is the third position, which is equip difference. That is, provide the different nations and states of the world with the instruments with which to invent new difference. Difference is not the problem, difference is the solution. And what we have to do is equip the states of the world with the ability to develop real and productive difference rather than to have this cult of the will to be different that is aroused in the presence of the waning of actual difference. If the world were forced to choose between an enforced convergence to the same practices and cultures and institutions and regressive nationalism, it would choose regressive nationalism. And if it were forced to choose between accepting the cause of political freedom in the institutional form that it takes in the rich North Atlantic countries, and rejecting that cause in order to be able to reject its institutional forms, it would reject that cause. So our whole interest is to provide humanity with a broader menu of options which would avoid these fatal choices. And this is the path to governing a world without world government. Through the cumulative force of the cooperative activity of states. Now, let me stop there, because I've had a cascade of propositions. Each more contentious than the previous one. So let's discuss that. Yes?
I think to me this makes a lot of sense in theory, but I'm having trouble understanding what would motivate a country to cooperate with another country that they might consider a rival.
Well, I think so. Begin with these coalitions that I described. So they're all practically motivated. That is, the G7 and the G20 meet because these major states have an agenda of problems that they can't solve alone. They require cooperation by the other states. The special purpose coalitions, obviously, there's some practical issue. Could be the climate issue, it could be a technological advance. So the individual states are unable to provide global public goods by themselves. They require the assistance of other states to do that. That's the practical motivation. And the practical motivation takes a distinct form in each of the three kinds of coalitions that I described. So it has a different form in the regional coalitions from the form that it has in the similar state coalitions or the special purpose coalitions. Now, it's only against the background of these multiple forms of cooperative activity among states that we can then begin to imagine and address the most difficult problem. The most difficult problem is armed conflict among the great powers. So what I'm suggesting is that the more we enmesh them in this net of forms of cooperative activity, the better. And then in that context, we work out this, what I described as an entente, in which we begin to define the reciprocal security interests of the major and the intermediate powers, and some mechanism for their reciprocal guarantee. That is, all the parties to these arrangements are co-guarantors of the vital security interests of the other powers. And that's the general mechanism. So the mechanism is a mechanism of self-interest, ultimately, in which a country is unable to solve these problems for itself. It requires cooperative activity. Now, there are 1,000 ways in which it can go wrong or it can come unstuck. And but this is the problem that we confront at the end of the day. Will we have a world empire, a world state? Because that's the only way in which we can prevent a world war. Or will we refuse to have such a world state despite the dangers of a war? Now, I think that's a theoretical question, because as a matter of fact, the world will not tolerate a world state. And so this is the decision which humanity has already made. And this is the reality against the background of which we must think. So there will be no world federation. There will be no world empire. And then only one thing remains, which is the cooperative activity of states along these different lines. And then going up to the most difficult problem of exploring their reciprocal security interests. Yes?
It seems as though the European Union, for instance, satisfies a lot of your conditions, including free mobility. And
Well, the European Union is often presented as an as a case for globalization, a model of globalization, of an alternative globalization. I would say, as a critic of the European Union, that it is a very imperfect model for globalization. Because what is the dominant architectural principle that has presided over the organization of the Union? It is that the power to define the basic arrangements, the organization of the economy and the politics, is increasingly centralized. De jure in Brussels, de facto in Berlin. And then the power to define the social and educational endowments of the citizens is delegated to the national and subnational authorities. So that arrangement is what I would describe as the European Union lying under the dead hand of technocratic centrism. So that's why in the European Union, everyone who is very young or very restless or very left or very right, is against the European Union. And the European Union is defended mostly by the centrists and by the people who are not completely alive, shall we say. That's the European Union. And what is the alternative to that? The alternative is to turn this principle upside down. So you would say, the vocation of the Union is to guarantee the endowments of all of its citizens so that they're capable. That's the haven. So they can stand up, so that they're empowered. But it should delegate the greatest authority to the member states and to the subnational authorities to diverge, to experiment. It's exactly the opposite of what I described. And now, how could that come about in the Union? It could come about only if the southern and eastern European member states collaborated with the oppositional forces within Germany and within France to force the redirection of the Union. It would never come about spontaneously. Now, similarly, going back to this earlier discussion of globalization and the change in the direction of globalization, how could it ever happen that globalization would change direction? So it wouldn't be like that form that I illustrated by the 4 principles of the trade regime and the alternatives, contrasted to the alternatives. How could it change in that opposite direction? Only if there are strong national projects down below, which hit against the limits imposed by the present form of globalization. That's how it would change. So the causal sequence that I'm imagining is there are strong national projects. What I define by strong national projects are projects that involve massive mobilization of resources, human, physical, economic, technological, and combine that with institutional experimentalism on a large scale, including experimentation about the form of the market economy and the form of democratic politics. Those strong national projects then hit against the limits of the established form of globalization. Specifically, they contradict the institutional maximalism. That leads to a change in globalization, and the change in globalization in turn allows the alternatives to go to develop even further. That's the kind of, so the change in globalization is not going to happen as the gift of an enlightened cosmopolitan elite to a restless humanity. It's only going to happen by force, by contradiction. That's what would happen in the European Union, and that's what would have to happen in the world. So that's what I'm imagining as the sequence. Yes?
The state European Union is a sort of convenient microcosm. Why would, obviously, those institutional arrangements develop for a reason? Because German taxpayers wouldn't want to take on that burden, or didn't want to take on
But I don't think it's a question of money. It's a question of the direction. So the Eastern European countries, if they're not to be pegged at an unfavorable position in the global division of labor, need to be able to experiment with the upgrade of their economies. So they have to go in the direction of a knowledge economy, of an inclusive knowledge economy. To do that, they need freedom to maneuver, freedom to experiment. They can't get that within the present rules of the Union. So that's why I'm saying that their national interest. So take the example of Greece, which is the most famous case recently in the evolution of the Union. The Greeks keep blaming the Germans. the Germans are not giving us money and so forth. The Greeks should blame themselves in the first instance. So the question is, what are they going to do in the world? What is their comparative advantage other than tourism going to be? That's what they have to figure out. And then, but to be able then to implement an idea of that, they need this larger freedom to reinvent their economy, to reestablish their form of democratic politics. So in that process in the European Union would be a microcosm of the process that I'm arguing for in the world as a whole. But the defense of a particular project is then the fuel of these alternatives. Yes.
So I have a question about the entente regarding security interests.
Yes.
It seems that there's a solid limit to the extent of that entente, which is that some countries have nuclear weapons and others don't.
Yes.
I guess my question is, do you believe in a kind of separate or sort of like a separate solution to the issue of nuclear weapons? Do you believe in a kind
Well,
of
of course, you know, the premise of the non-proliferation treaties was that the nuclear powers would eventually disarm. So obviously that doesn't happen. And this is then the issue that we confront. So I'll give you our example in Brazil. So we don't have nuclear weapons. We have nuclear powered submarines, but we don't have submarines armed with nuclear weapons. And our Constitution prohibits nuclear weapons, and the law prohibits nuclear weapons. But then the following question occurs. We don't want to live in a world in which only the peaceful are disarmed. The belligerent are armed to the teeth, and they're armed with nuclear weapons. So a world in which the peaceful countries are disarmed and the unpeaceful ones are armed to the teeth is not a safer world. So I would say this is an untenable system in the long run. Either the nuclear powers are going to disarm, or we are going to have a more generalized nuclear proliferation in the world. But the present system is not going to be maintained, that's for sure. I can say that now, thinking of the example of a particular country, as I just did. So how can we begin to address this problem? By enmeshing these countries, as I said, in this net of greater and greater cooperative activity. Because the more they cooperate in more ways, in more domains, by more vehicles, the more plausible it begins to imagine that they'd be willing to give some of these weapons up in return for a greater chance of more cooperation. So there's no other solution to this problem, and I think this is the fact of this world. So, and all of this is, as it were, a bet on which the underlying value is the value of diversity. At the end of the day, we have to choose between having a world empire or a world of armed states. And the armed states can ultimately bring about complete destruction. That's this choice that we have. Now, the more empowered we are, the more we're capable of cooperative activity, the more we can cooperate in many domains,